Hi guys, welcome back. So today I want to go into plot a bit more because if you remember a few months ago now actually, when I did the AuthorTube series, I did some initial plotting on the overall future storyline, but that was really just very rough in terms of trying to figure out what the story could be. And now that I'm working on Alex's story more in depth and I'm actually writing it out, I want to go into how to build a plot structure for a mystery story, because the opening story should be a mystery until the point where Alex figures out that those things are creatures, and then from there on, when it moves on to the next point of view character, it'll be a different kind of story, but the first part is really an opening mystery. Okay, so let's get started with the first thing. So if you remember, I talked about how I already have some plot beats laid out. What I've got so far is a very rough sketch of what Alex's story could look like. I broke it down into 6 plot beats. The problem that I have right now is that it's very muddy in terms of what actually happens in the middle of his story. So I have this opening scene, which is the opening mystery, right? And I have the conclusion of him ending up in the neighboring country in a town that was affected by those creatures first, and they're finding out that those things are creatures and basically that this is an invasion. And the last thing that Alex does is spread this information to his worlds, so that from there on out the secret is out that those creatures exist. Obviously the people in that world don't know what it is and don't really understand what is going on, right? That will all be part of the next story, but this is his end point. So I have the starting point, I have the end point, and I have some idea what should happen in the middle. There is some sort of hierarchy problem in his department, in this entire apparatus, where there is some cover-up going on. What I don't know yet is if it's intentional or if it is just politics, basically, where everyone is sort of dragging their feet and trying to avoid taking responsibility, not really understanding what they're doing with that. That's one thing that is in here. And then another thing that I don't really know is how exactly it plays out, the relationship between the two countries. Because right now, as I envision this world, is basically that Alex lives in one country and the invasion first started in a second country, a neighboring country that is more secluded and that has some political issues with Alex's country, possibly also neighboring countries, so that they have some motivation to obviously not spread this information right away when they first find out. That's something that I have to figure out, how this neighboring country and its influence spreads into Alex's investigation. And then the third thing that I want to include, that I don't really know how to include yet, is that there is a secret informant that knows what is going on and who is the one that points Alex in the right direction. And the reason for this is basically, first of all, I need some sort of connection between the two neighboring countries, a way for Alex to find out what is going on. The reason why I have this mysterious figure that I want to introduce is because, as you maybe remember, I have an idea for the overall story, right? And there are several storylines, several different worlds. It's a multiverse. The origin of what is going on, it's much larger than just one world being invaded. So this mysterious figure is someone that should be introduced at this point just in the form of some sort of informant or whatever, but that can take a double role later on in the story when we'll come back to the larger picture. So in Alex's story, I won't go in depth into who this informant is in terms of backstory and stuff like that, but utilize this figure here and their specific knowledge that they would have to help Alex with the investigation and basically link it to Alex's storyline so that later on the two elements are connected. So yeah, that's my starting point, and now what I want to do today is figure out the event chain of the mystery itself. So figuring out what exactly happens beat for beat and make it a natural chain that makes sense, so that then in next time's video I can go into building the mystery structure. So the difference would be that today I want to figure out what actually happens in the story, and next time what I want to do is how to constructed in a way that makes it the most intriguing, most fun to read it. The first thing that I want to take a look at is what I call the singular plot action. Now, I don't fully remember where I first came across this, but I think it was in the Poetics of Aristotle, which is basically probably the oldest writing advice book that exists. And in there is a segment where it talks about plot unity. And I don't remember anymore if it was called singular plot action in there or if I've got that name from somewhere else. If you've come across it, please let me know. But for now, right now, I'm referring to it as that because it's basically what it is. So it's the idea that your plot is made up of one key action that has to happen, and once that thing is done, the story is over. So this singular plot action, as an example, would be in Lord of the Rings. It's all about defeating Sauron, and there it takes different forms in different subplots. So for Frodo, it's all about destroying the ring because that's the key action that will defeat Sauron. But in other storylines, they're trying to defeat the armies of Mordor and fighting in other battles, and that's the same thing. It's all about defeating Sauron, just on different battlegrounds. This key action is this one thing that needs to be achieved, and from there it's broken down into different storylines of how this thing is achieved. And from what I understand, all stories that have a strong plot seem to be doing that, where basically they just have like this one thing that needs to be done, and it comes in different forms, of course, and for all kinds of stories. In TV shows or in series, it might even span over several books or episodes and so on, but it's really just one thing that needs to be achieved. And in stories where you feel like there's no real plot, there's something is really unsatisfying in terms of the storytelling, the story itself, it's often because there is not one thing that is achieved. It's just a series of things that happen that sometimes they connect, sometimes they don't. Some of those stories, they are still very enjoyable because you really love the characters and the setting, but there's still this sense of disappointment because the characters aren't really giving anything really great to do because the plot doesn't really make sense and doesn't really fit into each other. And so the only other thing that I could think of when reading this about having like this singular thing to do is that if you have a very character-driven story where basically the events start with the character, in that case, the singular plot action would be overcoming a flaw, for example. So if your character has a very strong flaw that causes them to lash out and do destructive things, and because of that all the events happen and they keep happening until the character overcomes that flaw and changes, that's basically your plot action, right? So once that thing is overcome, the character will stop getting in their own way, and then the story is also resolved. So it comes in very different forms for different stories, but it's really just about figuring out what actually happens in my story, this singular thing that happens in my story, and once that is done, the story is over. And in terms of how to figure out what that thing is, so I don't know if 6 months ago when I first had kind of like just this vague idea of I want to tell a future story where there's a war and an invasion going on, that wouldn't have been enough probably to figure out what my plot is about because I didn't have enough material. So now at this point, because I have a lot of details and stuff figured out, I am using this technique really just to take the ideas and material that I have and hone in on what I like and start to unify it with this kind of clear focus on what it is that I actually want to tell. I would use it for that. I don't know if you can use it on a completely green field kind of approach. Maybe you can, but for now, let's try to apply it in this way. So for me, the singular plot action is pretty clear in terms of Alex's story. Because for him, it's really just this mystery of he has to figure out what is going on in terms of what happened to those missing people. And then once he figured that out, it's really just about preventing it from happening again, right? So those are interlinked, it's the same thing. Find out what is going on, stop it from happening again. That's exactly what he does in the final chapter. He finds out that those things are creatures and that the people have gone missing because of those creatures, and then he reveals the information in an attempt to stop it from keep happening. And the way that I arrived at this was basically in an organic way, right? You saw it over a couple of weeks, starting to piece together what Alex's story is and how the opening happens. But it's basically the antagonist drives the story technique that I applied just in a longer form. So what I mean is, if you're not sure what that singular thing in your story is, go and start with your antagonist and what it is that they do, and their action usually leads to that singular thing that needs to be done. So in Lord of the Rings, it's really Sauron's actions that lead to him having to be stopped, right? And in the character-driven story that we talked about, it's really your character, and their flaw is really their own antagonist. So it's their own action that needs to be stopped. So in my story, it's because those things are invading Alex's world that this whole story kicks off, and what needs to be stopped is those things. They are invading this world, but because they are not known to the inhabitants in this world, it's really this mystery of figuring out what is going on that is the key action that needs to be taken in Alex's story. And the cool thing here is that because you start with your antagonist, you also very much link the plot to actual something that makes sense, right? Because when you link it to the antagonist's actions and everything originates from the antagonist's actions, it's much easier to figure out how the rest of the plot would unfold organically. They make it easier to figure out how the plot could play out in a satisfying and interesting way. Now, the next technique that I want to look at is, like I said, this chain of events, of making it logic, that it would happen in this way. So the plot event chain is a technique that I've come across in different forms, but I don't really know what's the official name, and I don't have an official source for it. We came across it in the Shailene video, I think, but also there, I don't really know if there is like, you know, a complete mythology behind it. What I did, I went with intuition and common sense to use it. So this is what it would look like if you get started, right? So the first thing that you take is obviously, what is the inciting incident? Why is this thing happening? Why is this story happening? So in my case, what you have here are the 9 plot beats basically until the 9th, where we get to when the story actually kicks off from the reader's perspective, from Alex's perspective. The events before that is really just the natural chain that I would envision. So this part was fairly easy in terms of figuring out how exactly this infection started. What happens is really just the portal opens without anyone noticing, and the first people get infected, and from there it spreads out in the same form as a virus and the zombie apocalypse stuff usually does. In this story, it starts in a neighboring country, and the neighboring country, trying to figure out what is going on, has kept that information for themselves so far. That's why the neighboring country, that's why Alex's country doesn't know yet that there is something similar going on in their neighboring country. And so then I get all the way to the opening scene, which we talked about, where basically the opening scene was the start of the problem for the protagonist. This is where Alex first comes into contact with what is going on, because he's the first person at the scene and ends up being pressured into taking on this case as the official investigator for it. This is where I have the whole setup in the chain, right? And then the next thing is to figure out, how does the chain continue in the investigation sense, and how does Alex go from this point to this end point of revealing what is going on to the world. Right now I'm just including the plot events in terms of this mystery thing, right? So if we come back to the singular plot action, it's about finding out what happened to the missing people, and all the plot beats in here are directly related to answering that question. So character moments as the family dinner scene, and how Alex has more pressure and figuring out more about who Alex is as a character and stuff like that. That's all things that I will add to this overview, but in the outlining video, and not right now. Right now I really just want the pure breakdown of this event in terms of the alien invasion and how it's found out in this world. The thing that I did is really just going with common sense, kind of like what happens naturally, right? Some of that is very much inspired from going with other plot archetypes. Like I said, in the starting scenario right now has a lot of plot points from typical zombie apocalypse stories in there. Very familiar beats. The next thing would be to take a bit more inspiration from crime mysteries and see what plot beats would fit in there. So that's one technique that I applied here to figure out the chain, is taking inspiration from plot archetypes, which is a callback to the Brandon Sanderson lecture that we did. And then another thing that you could do is, if like me, you struggle with figuring out what is in the middle, having the beginning and also having the end event. So here, I don't know which plot beat it is, but I do know already that in his last minutes, Alex has learned that he's infected, and then using his transformation, whatever the transformation looks like, and also live streams it to the world. There is a bit a question, because I haven't really done a lot of work in terms of world building. Is there live streaming? You know, what does the technology look like, or is there something that is similar to that? But for now, kind of as a placeholder, what happens in terms of the events itself, it's that he has this transformation, and then this is broadcasted to the rest of his world. So that's my final event, right? And one thing that you could also do if you struggle with going in chronological order because you hit a roadblock, it's to go backwards from the final event and try to figure out how we got here in that sense. So what I'm planning to do here is basically to combine the two. So going in both directions and trying to make it easier to figure out the middle by going with backwards approach whenever I'm stuck in the chronological one, and so on. Another approach is to go with character motivations. Alex here at 10 has found those missing people's clothes. The next plot beat would probably be a result from his action rather than just him basically reacting to what is going on. So from here it would tie into what is his motivation and his goal, and tying more into who the character is and how they go about doing things. So this is probably where the investigation starts, and there it would be the next logical step in the investigation. So here the next thing would be having relative interviews. And then another approach that you could use to figure out how this chain comes together when you're stuck would be to go with the whole thing. What is the worst thing that can happen? So if you remember in one of my shorts, I talked about this technique. The idea is it can only get worse. It's really no matter what element you introduce into the story, new events, new characters, even coincidences, no matter what happens, it makes it worse for the protagonist. It's especially good when you are completely stuck and don't know how the characters themselves could drive the plot forward. Having a misfortune that makes things worse for them is a really nice way of basically cheating by having the plot happen to the characters, but doing it in a way that is satisfying and interesting because it makes things worse. So that's basically what I'm doing right now. So taking all these approaches, working forward and backwards, taking Alex's motivation as a way to make it more his actions and him driving the plot, and then also making everything worse, while taking heavy inspiration from zombie stories, not so much anymore because I kind of have to start there, silent invasion stories like The Veiling or the silent invasion of the Body Snatchers is another inspiration that I have in this kind of story, and also government conspiracy story. At the low point, which actually happens here at number, right now I have it at 4, but I think it makes more sense that it happens at the end of chapter 3, is that Alex gets fired. So that's the worst thing that could happen to him. In his world, that is like dying socially, right? And it's supposed to be this whole thing of where at the midpoint, what he thought was the worst thing that could happen to him happens. And then when he uncovers what is actually going on, and then at the end of the story actually dies, it's kind of like supposed to illustrate how this world is so focused in on their own survival games in their society that they have no idea that they've just been thrown into this massive survival struggle in this multiverse. So yeah, those are the approaches that I'm going to use to flesh out my chain a bit more. Then next time, like I said, what we're going to look at is building it out into a mystery structure. So I will show you next time what I came up with, and then we'll reshape it into how to tell it in a way that makes it most interesting for the reader.